Over the weekend, Ukraine launched a surprise drone attack against a number of Russian military bases, many of which were deep inside Russian territory. Some people in the news are calling this Russia's Pearl Harbor. But is it? Reports say that a number of Russian strategic bombers were damaged or destroyed. There's some debate over how much damage there actually was. Ukraine's claiming 40 or so aircraft, and Russia's claiming, like 3 or 4. And it's hard to tell what's going on in these kinds of situations. Many people are concerned about how Russia's going to respond to this attack. And maybe one way to think about it is, if Russia had conducted a similar attack against Ukraine, how would Ukraine have responded? Hello everyone, I'm Bobtheorc, and tonight we are going to talk about what's happening in Ukraine and try to come up with an idea of how we can tell who's winning and who's not, because let's face it, I really don't trust anybody. So, some people are calling this a Russian Pearl Harbor. But what's the difference between Pearl Harbor and the Battle of the Bulge? So let's think about that for a moment. In December of 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack against the United States fleet in Pearl Harbor. While World War II had already been going on for a number of years, the United States was not yet involved, and so this attack was theoretically a complete surprise. Now, some people think that Roosevelt knew it was going to happen, he let it happen so he could get into the war. We're not going to go down that path. But the point is that the Japanese attack force destroyed pretty much the entire United States battleship fleet. The aircraft carriers were out at sea at the time, and then Japan followed up with a series of attacks damaging the United States, culminating in the Battle of Midway, where the United States was able to turn the tides, destroy the Japanese carrier fleets at some loss to ourselves. And at that point, Japan was basically on the defensive for the rest of the war. Is that what's happening here? Maybe. The Battle of the Bulge happened towards the end of World War II, when Germany was already losing. They were already pretty screwed. The Russians were closing in from the east, the Americans and British were closing in from the west, and we were bombing the crap out of their factories and cities. They were pretty screwed. And so they gathered the last of their resources to do one last big attack into the Ardennes, hoping to drive a wedge between the British and American forces and try to get some sort of a repeat of the Battle of Dunkirk to force them off the continent of Europe. But they didn't have the supplies to follow through. The attack, while strong and made some progress, it stalled out when the Germans were running out of supplies. They were somewhat dependent on capturing Allied supplies and fuel to keep going. And after they lost momentum, they didn't have the means to follow up, and then it was just a matter of time before they were defeated. And while it was a setback, it didn't really work out so well. Now, actually, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, that didn't really work out so well either. Now, they were able to follow up. Now, Japan was in a situation where they didn't have the supplies for a long and protracted war, so they were hoping that if they could knock out the U.S. fleet and just hammer the crap out of us, that we would negotiate peace. Obviously, they didn't know Americans very well, and we don't like negotiating peace because we get pissed. Likewise, perhaps the Ukrainians are hoping that a big attack on Russia right before their Istanbul peace negotiations will cause the Russians to cave to Ukrainian demands. But let's face it, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are the type of people who like to surrender. So, how do we know what's going to happen? Well, the attack itself was kind of ingenious. I've known for a while, according to some friends in Russia, that the Ukrainians were sneaking in drones into Russia or building drones inside of Russia and sneaking them around in trucks and launching them. This is happening on a very small scale. Mysterious fires at factories and far-off regions. One of my friends sent me a video of a drone hitting their dad's oil refinery that he worked at. That was a little over a year ago, I think. And so we know that these attacks have been happening for a while, and we know that Russia knows about it because Russia will occasionally shut off their internet or their cellular service to disrupt Ukrainian drone attacks and other activities inside Russian territory, which is very frustrating to the Russian people, but so is getting blown up by drones. So the real challenge is this: how do we know what's actually going on? Because we can't really trust what Russia says, we can't really trust what Ukraine says, and we can't really trust what our government says, because let's face it, politicians get paid to lie. That's why they're politicians. Now, in the days preceding the attack, Ukraine had been launching several hundred drones each day into Russian territory in the direction of Moscow. And some analysts thought that this was just an effort to wear down Russian defenses so they could go and just grind and hit targets inside Moscow. Now, many of these drones apparently didn't even have warheads, but there's no way the Russians can know about it. And here's the math about drone attacks or missiles. It generally takes 2 to 3 defensive missiles to shoot down an incoming attack. Drones can be pretty cheap, a few $1,000s, or maybe even for the small ones, or maybe a few tens of thousands of dollars for the bigger ones. And interceptor missiles probably cost a few tens of $1,000s also. I think that the Israeli Iron Dome missiles, for example, cost about 40 grand a pop, whereas the Patriot missiles that we use cost quite a bit more. And so it just comes down to economic warfare. This is a war of attrition. And so if you can launch a $10,000 drone to eat up $100,000 of defensive missiles to shoot it down, then you're grinding down the enemy's economy. This is why right now, in the age of drone warfare and cruise missiles, everything favors the attacker. And while Russia claims to have quite a bit of success shooting down Ukrainian drones, it's costing them more money than it's costing the Ukrainians to defend themselves. Likewise, when the Russians fire stuff into Ukraine, it's costing Ukraine far more money, our money actually, to defend against the Russian missiles and drones, because they also need 2 or 3 anti-drone, anti-cruise missiles to, for every missile or drone they're trying to shoot down. And you can do it with like fighter jets, and there's other ways to do it. I think some people are working on like laser technology and drone technology. There's all kinds of other things that people are trying to develop that'll be cheaper. But right now the math is it costs more money to shoot down an incoming missile than it costs to launch the missile in the first place. Now these missiles have limited range, and so this is why Ukraine had to truck in or sneak in missiles deep into Russia, because Russia's really big. Russia has a bigger surface area than Pluto, which is still a planet, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Just so you know, Pluto is a planet, from one astrophysicist to another. But yeah, Russia's bigger than Pluto, so it's huge. Whereas Ukraine is like the size of Texas, and so the Russians can shoot missiles easily from one side of Ukraine to the other, getting deep into Russia. And most of Russian industry is east of the Ural Mountains. They did this after or during World War II, after the Germans were approaching in, because they didn't want to get all their stuff blown up. And they've left that, they left their industry east of the Urals pretty much ever since. So what I'm looking for is, I want to see what happens over the next coming days and coming weeks. Now, if this is a Pearl Harbor type incident, then it's going to be like how the Japanese were just attacking and attacking and attacking, because surprise attacks only work if you either knock out your opponent in one decisive strike, or if you knock him down to where you have an advantage and then you keep pressing the advantage. If you sucker punch somebody and then you let them catch their breath, now all you have is a really pissed off opponent who's going to hit you back. So if Ukraine keeps up the attack for a sustained period of time, then this is going to be more of a Pearl Harbor moment. If they keep up the attack for a short period of time and then can't sustain it, then that's really going to be more of a battle of the Bulge. And that's going to imply that Ukraine is not doing so well, and they're just trying to get some last-ditch damage in, or a Hail Mary to try and shake things up. Because, remember, Russia has like 100 million people more than Ukraine does. This means that Ukraine has to kill like 5 or 10 Russian soldiers for every Ukrainian soldier that gets killed. Now, the Ukrainians claim they're doing it, and the Russians claim that they're also killing Ukrainians at a rate of 10 to 1. And I don't believe either of them, right? So how do we know? Well, supposedly the Russians are firing more stuff into Ukraine than Ukraine's firing back, but recently Ukraine's been firing a lot of stuff into Russia too, and we really can't trust those numbers either. So what I'm going to be looking for is basically who's running out of gas first. At some point, because everybody loves posting this stuff on social media. The Ukrainians love posting their drone strikes on social media. The Russians love posting their stuff on social media. Everybody's posting everything on social media. And there's a number of places, like the Military Summary Channel, who will geolocate these various social media posts from a variety of sources, pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian sources. And that gives us some idea of what's going on. But does it? You know, according to the various mappers, you can look at the pro-Ukrainian mappers, and you can look at the pro-Russian mappers and the independent mappers. They all show that Russia's slowly marching deeper and deeper into Ukraine. They are marching west. Excuse me. And it looks like the Russians are opening up another front to the north to try and grind down the Ukrainians. And that makes sense because this is a war of attrition. But just because the Russians are advancing doesn't mean that they're winning. You know, maybe the Ukrainian army is fighting a withdrawal, a defensive withdrawal strategy, fighting from one defensive position to another to try and wear down the Russian forces at a greater rate than the Ukrainians are suffering. That could be. You know, there's no way to really know for sure. I think that, not that anybody's asked me, and not that I really want to give either side advice, but if I were fighting a larger opponent, I was unable to do a knockout blow to take him out quickly, I would probably do a defensive strategy. Because launching attacks against prepared positions is very wasteful, right? When Ukraine attacks Russia, they tend to lose more soldiers than the Russians lose, and when Russia is attacking Ukraine, you would imagine be the same. Now, this war is different because everybody's using remote warfare. They're launching drones and cruise missiles and artillery and just blasting away. And so the Russian argument is that they're blasting the hell out of the Ukrainian positions, and then they're marching into these destroyed towns after everything has been cleared out, or after the Ukrainian resistance has been largely crushed. And then the Ukrainians, of course, say, no, that's not true. We're fighting until it's not feasible. We're inflicting maximum casualties on the Russians, then we're bailing out before things get bad. Because typically a lot of the casualties suffered in warfare happen on the retreat. You know, if you have a disorganized retreat, you're going to get nailed. That's why, like in the medieval times, after they routed the enemy army, they'd send the cavalry in to just stomp over the enemy forces and just crush them. You know, Sun Tzu Art of War, always give your enemy a means to retreat, because once they start retreating, you'll be able to go and inflict even more casualties. So it's hard to tell what's going on, but if the Ukrainians are retreating in an organized fashion, then they could be inflicting lots of damage. So really the only thing we can look at is, when it comes to these drone strikes and cruise missile strikes, basically who's shooting more stuff at the enemy. Because one of the other things that happens in a war of attrition is it just comes down to economics and manufacturing. You know, math is a harsh mistress and will tell you what's going on, and whichever side is throwing more stuff at the other is probably also inflicting more casualties. So, and just remember, the Ukrainians have to inflict far more casualties against the Russians just to diminish the Russian population at a similar rate, you know, proportional, right? Because the Russians have like 5 to 10 times more people. that being said, if a bunch of body bags start coming home, then populations tend to start getting pissed off. And so it's in everybody's best interest to lie about how many people are getting killed, because you don't want your population to get pissed and kick you out of office. So this is what I'm going to be looking for. I'm going to be looking for who is sending more drones and missiles into the other's territory for an extended period of time, not just a few days, but weeks and months, because this thing's going to drag out. Let's be real. They're not going to negotiate peace. The Russians and Ukrainians both have very solid ideas of what a peace agreement looks like, and the Russians are over here and the Ukrainians are over here, and they're nowhere near each other. You know, the Russians want Ukraine to effectively surrender, and the Ukrainians want Russia to effectively surrender, and neither side is going to do that. And that's just what we're looking at. So how are the Russians going to respond? They're going to respond the same way the Ukrainians are going to respond. They're going to just keep fighting. You know, why wouldn't they keep fighting? You know, it's obvious that neither side's going to stop. Zelensky is not going to step down, and if he stepped down, he'd be replaced by some other, you know, Western puppet. And Putin's not going to step down, and if he did step down, he'd be replaced by, you know, another Russian who would probably be even more harsh than Putin is. Because remember, by Russian standards, Putin's considered to be pretty chill compared to like Medvedev and some of the other guys. So I think this is going to keep going, and you know, like they say, how do you go bankrupt? Slowly and then suddenly. This is going to be a slow grind until one side capitulates, and then it's going to fall apart pretty quick. But we don't know when that's going to happen. And so I'm going to just be following how many drone strikes are being shot, you know, into the other side, how many missile strikes, because that's really the only thing we can measure, because these guys just love posting their stuff on social media. And as long as the drone strikes keep happening, we know that it's going on. And remember, both sides are targeting the other's drone operators. They're targeting the other's, you know, long-range weaponry. The foot soldiers in the trenches, they're just there to guard the long-range missiles and the drone operators. They're just holding the line. They're not really directly engaging each other that much. You know, sometimes you'll have these shock troopers taking the other trenches and whatnot, but that's usually not happening till things have been pretty softened up. So, you know, there could be a big Russian breakthrough should the Ukrainian army fall apart, but I think they're going to hold together longer than we would expect. And Ukraine doesn't have the numbers to go deep inside of Russia. You know, when they did their big Kursk offensive, that, you know, that was a sideshow. That was like a sideshow of a sideshow. It never really threatened anything. They were trying to, well, they were committing like 100,000 troops to go hit some gas pipeline junction. Come on, that's dumb. That was never going to do anything to stop the Russians. And so, you know, I think that you're not going to have some big breakthrough on the Ukrainian side. And, you know, if the Russians go deep inside of Ukrainian territory, then they're going to leave the umbrella of their air defense. And then the Ukrainian drones will start really nailing the Russian defenders. And if you look at the logistics lines that people are making, just leading up to the front lines, they're building these roads with these nets covering the roads to protect against the drones. So, you know, a lot of effort is going into just advancing a little bit. So this is going to be a grind. So this is what I'm watching for. Which side stops launching the drones first, or rather the rate at which either side is launching. So that's my perspective. I think this is going to go for a while, and I don't see any reason why there's going to be peace, which is very unfortunate. Anyway, I hope you liked the video. These are my thoughts. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and I'll be happy to talk about you know, anything that comes to mind. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you, and goodbye. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did like it, subscribe to my channel and share it with your friends. You can also check out my website, Bobtheorc.com, where you can download a free copy of my dad's book and some other things. Have a nice day. Goodbye.